The year is 1944. Deep in occupied Europe, rumors swirl of an audacious Nazi plan to recruit American soldiers into the ranks of Hitler's elite SS. They would call it the George Washington Legion, a unit of American turncoats who would fight against their own country. But how much of this is fact and how much is fiction? Today, we're diving deep into one of World War II's most controversial and little-known stories: Americans who wore the uniform of the SS. If you've read World War II thrillers or watched certain documentaries, you've probably heard of the George Washington Legion. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? An entire unit of American SS soldiers fighting under the banner of George Washington against their own countrymen. Authors like Jack Higgins have written compelling fiction about such units, weaving tales of American renegades in German uniform. But here's the truth: the George Washington Legion, as a formal military unit, never existed. It's a fictional creation that has taken on a life of its own in popular culture. The reality is actually more complex and, in some ways, more interesting than the fiction. The Germans did attempt to recruit Americans. They succeeded with some. But there were never enough volunteers to justify creating a dedicated American SS unit with its own designation, uniform, and command structure. Unlike other foreign SS units, the French Charlemagne Division, the Scandinavian Nordland Division, or even the tiny British Free Corps, there was no American equivalent. So if the George Washington Legion didn't exist, what did? The answer takes us into the shadowy world of wartime propaganda, ideological defection, and individual Americans who, for various reasons, chose to betray their country. To understand the American story, we first need to understand the SS's broader recruitment strategy. Heinrich Himmler's SS began the war as an exclusively German organization, obsessed with racial purity and Germanic supremacy. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, pragmatism overtook ideology. By 1943 and 1944, the SS was recruiting from across occupied Europe. Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, French, Belgians, Dutch, Norwegians, Danes, men from dozens of nations donned the distinctive SS runes. Some were motivated by anti-communism, fearing Soviet expansion more than they hated Nazi Germany. Others were opportunists, collaborators, or true believers in fascist ideology. The Germans even formed the British Free Corps, recruiting from Allied prisoners of war. This unit, despite German propaganda efforts, managed to recruit only 58 men throughout the entire war. Think about that. Out of thousands of British POWs, only 58 could be convinced to turn their coats. It was a propaganda failure, but it proved the Germans were willing to recruit even from their enemies. So when tens of thousands of American soldiers fell into German hands during the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 and 1945, the SS saw an opportunity. Many of these Americans had German ancestry. Their grandparents or great-grandparents had emigrated from Germany. Perhaps the Nazis reasoned these men could be convinced to fight for the fatherland. They were largely wrong. The vast majority of captured Americans remained loyal. They endured the hardships of POW camps rather than collaborate. But a handful, a very small handful, made a different choice. Before we get to the wartime traitors, we need to rewind to the 1930s. America before Pearl Harbor was a very different place. Isolationism was strong. Many Americans had no desire to get involved in Europe's problems. And believe it or not, there was a fairly large Nazi organization operating openly in the United States. The German-American Bund held rallies, published newspapers, and promoted Nazi ideology to German-American communities. In 1939, they held a massive rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City, complete with swastika banners and Nazi salutes. 20,000 people attended. This wasn't happening in secret. It was out in the open. Some Americans living in Europe when war broke out in 1939 made the fateful decision to join German military forces. For some, it was about heritage. They had a German parent which classified them as Volksdeutsche, or ethnic Germans, in Nazi racial terminology. For others, it was ideological. They believed in fascism, or they were virulently anti-communist, or they admired German military power. When Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Americans still in Europe faced a choice: return home to fight for the United States, accept internment as enemy aliens, or, in rare cases, actively side with Germany. That last option was treason. Under American law, taking up arms against your country during wartime is the ultimate betrayal, punishable by death. Yet some Americans made exactly that choice, and one of them would become the most spectacular example of an American traitor in the SS. Let me tell you about Martin James Monti. His story is so extraordinary that if you read it in a novel, you'd probably think it was too far-fetched to be believable. But every word of this is true. Martin Monti was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1921. His father was Swiss-Italian, an immigrant who had come to America seeking opportunity. His mother was of German descent. Monti grew up as an all-American kid, but he harbored a deep hatred of communism that would eventually lead him down a dark path. In October 1942, with America fully committed to World War II, Monti enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. He was smart, capable, and he had a gift for flying. By early 1944, he had earned his wings and his officer's commission as a second lieutenant. He was qualified on 2 of America's premier fighter aircraft, the P-39 Airacobra and the P-38 Lightning, a distinctive twin-engine fighter that struck fear into Axis pilots. Monti was assigned to the China-Burma-India Theater, stationed at the 126th Replacement Depot in Karachi, in what is now Pakistan. By this time, he'd been promoted to first lieutenant. His future looked bright. He was an American officer, a pilot, fighting for his country in a just war against tyranny. And then Monti did something that still baffles historians today. In October 1944, First Lieutenant Martin Monti went absent without leave. He didn't just disappear for a few days, he launched himself on an elaborate journey that could only have one destination. He hitched a ride on a C-46 transport aircraft heading west, ending up in Cairo, Egypt. From there, he made his way to Tripoli and then to the Italian front. Monti arrived at an airfield near Naples, operated by the 354th Air Service Squadron. This unit's job was to prepare aircraft for assignment to frontline fighter squadrons. They would repair, test, and certify aircraft as ready for combat. And Monti, with his pilot qualifications and his officer's uniform, fit right in. On October 13, 1944, Monti noticed an F-5E Lightning on the airfield. This was a photo reconnaissance variant of the P-38 fighter he was qualified on, unarmed but fast and with long range. It had just been repaired and needed a test flight before being sent to an operational unit. Monti volunteered for that test flight. He climbed into the cockpit, fired up the engines, and took off. But instead of testing the aircraft over friendly territory, he pointed the nose north toward German-occupied northern Italy. He flew deep into enemy territory and landed at Milan. The Germans couldn't believe their luck. An American pilot had just delivered them a perfectly intact, state-of-the-art American reconnaissance aircraft. The F-5E was immediately turned over to Circus Rosarius, a special Luftwaffe unit dedicated to testing captured Allied aircraft. German pilots would fly the Lightning, learning its capabilities and weaknesses. But what about Monti himself? He was taken prisoner, of course, but he had a story ready. He claimed he had defected to the Axis cause. He was anti-communist, he said. He wanted to fight against the real enemy, the Soviet Union. The Germans had encountered defectors before, and they knew how to use them. Allied soldiers who turned coat were valuable for propaganda purposes. The Nazis operated several radio stations that broadcast to Allied troops, trying to demoralize them, spread dissent, and encourage more defections. In 1944, Monti was brought to Berlin to make a test radio broadcast. The Germans wanted to see if this American traitor could be useful as a propagandist. He would join other turncoats like Mildred Gillers, an American woman who broadcast Nazi propaganda under the name Axis Sally. She would later be convicted of treason and serve 12 years in prison. But Monti wasn't very good at radio work. He lacked the charisma and the delivery needed for effective propaganda broadcasting. So the Germans found another use for him. They offered him a position in the SS. Think about that for a moment. An American citizen, a commissioned officer in the United States Army Air Forces, was about to put on the uniform of Hitler's SS, the organization responsible for some of the worst atrocities in human history. Monti accepted. He was inducted as an SS Untersturmführer, equivalent to a second lieutenant, into a unit called the SS Standarte Kurt Eggers. This was a specialized propaganda unit, a formation of war correspondents and reporters in uniform. They were embedded with combat units, writing articles for SS newspapers, producing propaganda materials, and documenting the war from the German perspective. This wasn't safe desk work in Berlin. The SS Standarte Kurt Eggers operated close to the front lines. Many of its members were killed in action. Monti would be serving in a genuine SS combat formation, wearing the Death's Head insignia and the SS runes. To distance himself from his American identity, or perhaps to embrace his German heritage, Monti began using his mother's maiden name, Wiethaupt. As Martin Wiethaupt, he was an SS officer serving the Third Reich. The SS Standarte Kurt Eggers was named after an SS war correspondent killed in action in 1943. It was a unique unit within the SS structure focused on media and propaganda rather than direct combat, though its members often found themselves in dangerous situations. What's particularly interesting about this unit is how international it was. Monti wasn't the only Allied citizen serving in its ranks. There were at least 3 British citizens and 1 New Zealander in the unit. Some of these men would later transfer to the British Free Corps, that tiny unit of British SS volunteers we mentioned earlier. Monti also served alongside another American. This man was Peter Delaney, an SS Hauptsturmführer, an SS captain who was born in Louisiana. Delaney is a mysterious figure. Historians believe he may have previously served in the French Foreign Legion, that legendary formation of soldiers from around the world serving France. If this is true, Delaney had a long history of military service before ending up in the SS. It's possible that Delaney was instrumental in recruiting Monti into the SS Standarte Kurt Eggers. Having another American in the unit would have made Monti's transition easier. Whatever the case, here were 2 American citizens, serving as SS officers, working for Nazi Germany while their countrymen fought and died to defeat Hitler. Monti's specific job in the unit was to write propaganda leaflets aimed at Allied prisoners of war. These leaflets would be distributed in POW camps, trying to convince captured American, British, and other Allied soldiers to join the fight against communism. The message was consistent. The real enemy isn't Nazi Germany, it's the Soviet Union. Join us in fighting Bolshevism. There's no evidence that Monti's leaflets convinced anyone to defect. The overwhelming majority of Allied POWs remained loyal to their countries, enduring harsh conditions rather than collaborate with their captors. But Monti tried, and in doing so, committed repeated acts of treason against the United States. Monti served with the SS Standarte Kurt Eggers in northern Italy as the war entered its final months. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Allied armies were closing in from all directions. The Thousand-Year Reich was collapsing. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. 2 days later, on May 10th, Martin Monti walked into American custody. He was still wearing his SS officer's uniform, complete with the insignia of his rank and unit. You might think this would be the end of Monti's story: arrest, trial, execution for treason. But what happened next is almost as extraordinary as his defection. Monti was court-martialed in 1946, but not for treason. He was charged with desertion and with stealing an aircraft, the F-5E Lightning he'd flown to Milan. These were serious charges, and he was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. But here's where it gets strange. His service in the SS was overlooked. Either through bureaucratic confusion, deliberate oversight, or plea bargaining, Monti's time as an SS officer wasn't part of the 1946 court-martial. Even more incredibly, his prison sentence was suspended. And then, and I'm not making this up, Martin Monti was allowed to re-enlist in the United States Army Air Forces in February 1947. The man who had defected to Nazi Germany, stolen an American aircraft, and served as an SS officer was back in American uniform, this time as a private. Monti served competently enough that by the time of his honorable discharge in January 1948, he had been promoted to sergeant. He must have thought he'd gotten away with it. He'd committed treason, served the SS, and somehow landed back in the good graces of the American military. But justice, though delayed, was coming. Just minutes after receiving his honorable discharge from the armed forces on January 15, 1948, Martin Monti was arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI had been building a case against him, and they'd been waiting for the right moment. Monti was charged under his SS alias, Martin Haupt, with treasonous acts against the United States. The indictment listed 21 separate acts of treason, 21 times when Monti had actively worked against American interests while serving in the SS. The trial didn't last long. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing Monti in SS uniform. Documents proved his membership in the SS Standarte Kurt Eggers. His own leaflets, urging American POWs to defect, were entered into evidence. On January 17, 1949, Martin James Monti pleaded guilty to treason. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and fined $10,000, a substantial sum in 1949. Monti was sent to the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, one of America's most notorious federal prisons. He served 11 years before being paroled in 1960. After his release, he lived in obscurity. His past as an SS officer, a dark secret he rarely discussed. Martin James Monti died in the year 2000 at the age of 78. He remains one of the most spectacular examples of an American who committed treason during World War II, and the only verified case of an American officer who actively served in the SS. Monti's story is the most well-documented case, but he wasn't the only American to serve Germany during the war. The historical record contains hints and fragments of other cases, though details are often scarce. We know that several Americans living in Germany before the war chose to stay and serve in various capacities. Some worked as translators or in administrative roles. Others may have served in propaganda roles similar to Axis Sally and other radio broadcasters. There are unconfirmed reports of Americans serving in other German military branches, not just the SS. Some may have been drafted if they held dual citizenship or if they were classified as Volksdeutsche based on their ancestry. The exact number of Americans who served Germany will probably never be known. Many records were destroyed in the chaos of Germany's defeat. Others remain classified or lost in archives. What we do know is that the number was small, probably fewer than 50 individuals in total, and possibly far fewer. This is actually a testament to the loyalty of the vast majority of Americans during the war. Despite Nazi attempts at recruitment, despite propaganda efforts, despite the presence of a German-American community numbering in the millions, virtually no Americans turned traitor. This brings us to the most difficult question. Why? Why would American citizens betray their country to serve Nazi Germany? For some, like Monti, the answer seems to be ideological. Monti was virulently anti-communist. He genuinely believed that the Soviet Union posed a greater threat to the world than Nazi Germany. In his twisted logic, serving the SS was a way to fight communism, even if it meant betraying his own country. This anti-communist motivation was shared by many foreign volunteers in the SS. The Germans exploited this fear brilliantly, portraying themselves as Europe's defenders against Bolshevism. For some volunteers, particularly from Eastern Europe, this message resonated strongly. Others may have been motivated by their German heritage. In the 1940s, ethnic identity was taken much more seriously than it is today. Someone with German parents or grandparents might feel a genuine connection to Germany, even if they'd been born and raised in America. The Nazi concept of Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans, regardless of citizenship, gave ideological cover to this identity. Some were probably opportunists. Serving Germany might have seemed like a way to avoid the hardships of POW camps or to gain privileges. In the chaos of war, people make decisions based on survival, and some, we have to acknowledge, were true believers in Nazi ideology. They were fascists, anti-Semites, or believers in racial supremacy. These motivations are the hardest to confront, but we can't ignore them. So what do we make of these American SS renegades? What's the legacy of this dark chapter? First, we should acknowledge how rare these cases were. Out of millions of Americans who served in World War II, only a handful turned traitor. This is actually quite remarkable when you think about the pressures and opportunities for defection that existed. Second, these stories remind us that loyalty isn't automatic. Citizenship doesn't guarantee patriotism. In every society, even in the midst of a just war, there will be individuals who make choices that their fellow citizens find incomprehensible. Third, the Monti case in particular highlights the importance of accountability. It took years, but eventually justice was served. Monti paid for his treason with 11 years of his freedom. His story serves as a warning to anyone who might consider betraying their country. But perhaps most importantly, these stories are a reminder of the complexity of World War II. We often think of it in simple terms, good versus evil, allies versus Axis. And in the broad strokes, that's accurate. But when you zoom in on individual stories, you find confusion, divided loyalties, and choices that defy easy explanation. The myth of the George Washington Legion may be fiction, but the reality of Americans serving in the SS is uncomfortable fact. History isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's dark, complicated, and disturbing. Today, we've uncovered the truth behind the George Washington Legion legend. We've learned that while a formal American SS unit never existed, individual Americans did serve Nazi Germany in various capacities. We've followed the extraordinary story of Martin James Monti, the American pilot who defected with a stolen aircraft and ended up as an SS officer. These are stories worth remembering, not to glorify the traitors, but to understand the full scope of World War II's human drama. They remind us that even in the clearest moral conflicts, individuals make surprising choices. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to the channel. History is full of stories that deserve to be told, and together we'll continue exploring them. Until next time, this has been a journey into one of World War II's most controversial corners. Remember the past, learn from it, and never forget the price of freedom.